Evidently, the century of humiliation is over. Coming to you live from deep in the hood, this is the Eurasian Century. So, we've got a lot to get to tonight here. I want to start out with the Silk Road because the major thing about China right now that's affecting geopolitics is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. In China, it's called One Belt, One Road, but it's been shortened to Belt and Road Initiative. The Silk Road was a trade route in the old world from like late in the second century BC, linking China and the West that carried goods and ideas between the two great civilizations of Rome and China. Um, Silk went westward, and wools and gold and silver went eastward. The Silk Road began in north central China in Xi'an, in modern Shanxi province. A caravan track stretched west along the Great Wall of China, along the Pamirs, through Afghanistan and into the Levant and Anatolia. Its length was about 4,000 miles. It's about 6,400 kilometers. Goods were then shipped to Europe through the Mediterranean Sea. The Silk Road derives its name from the highly lucrative trade of textiles, silk textiles, that were produced in China almost exclusively. The network began with the Han Dynasty's expansion into central China around 114 BC through missions and exploration of the Chinese imperial envoy Shang Qian, which brought the region under unified control. The Parthian Empire provided a bridge to East Africa and the Mediterranean. By the early 1st century BC, Chinese silk was widely sought after in Rome, Egypt, and Greece. Other valuable commodities from the East included tea, dyes, perfume, and porcelain. Other Western exports were horses, camels, honey, and wine. This generated considerable wealth for emerging mercantile classes, and the widespread trade in goods such as paper and gunpowder greatly influenced world history. With the gradual loss of Roman territory in Asia, the rise of the Arabian power in Levant, the Silk Road became increasingly unsafe and untraveled. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the route was revived under the Mongols, and that was the time of the Venetian Marco Polo. He used it to travel to China, and despite surviving many changes and disruptions, the Silk Road abruptly lost its importance with the rise of the Ottoman Empire in 1453 with the sacking of Constantinople, which almost immediately severed trade between the East and West. And this caused the European efforts to seek alternative routes to the East. And this could be said to be the beginning of the Age of Discovery and also European colonialism. I want to give a short rundown of the Century of Humiliation, some of the highlights. um, Chinese nationalists in the 20s and 30s dated the Century of Humiliation to the mid 19th century, from the First Opium War in the Qing Dynasty. Defeats by foreign powers that were cited as part of this century of humiliation included Western and Japanese trade in opium to China from the 1800s to 1940s, defeated in the First Opium War from 1939 to 1942 by the British and the occupation of Hong Kong. A host of unequal treaties throughout this period. The Second Opium War, which ceded Outer Manchuria to Russia, defeated in the First Sino-Japanese War by Japan, which resulted in the Japanese colonization of Taiwan and the takeover of Korea. The Eight-Nation Alliance invasion to suppress the Boxer Uprising. This was 1899 to 1901, and the resulting Boxer Protocol, which imposed reparations in excess of the government's annual tax revenue. The Japanese invasion of Liaodong during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, in which German territory in China was handed to Japan and led to the anti-imperialist May 4th movement. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to 1932, Soviet invasion of Xinjiang, January to April of 1934, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which overlaps the Second World War, what we call the Second World War, 1937 to 1945, during which numerous and widespread war crimes were committed by Japanese forces, most infamously the Nanjing Massacre, and they also did lethal human experimentation, much like the Germans did. So the Chinese had a rough time, and they feel they have a bone to pick based on all this. And essentially they want to secure themselves in the world and avoid such things in the future. Usually the century of humiliation is said to end with Mao Zedong. Sun Yat-sen was the kind of intellectual and political leader of the first Chinese Revolution in 1912. But Mao Zedong, who had been with the Chinese nationalists earlier, split off, became a communist, and conquered China for communism and drove the nationalists onto Taiwan. I'm only going to summarize Mao briefly because he alone could be the subject of many programs. Likely, he's the worst mass murderer in history and also responsible for the industrialization of China and its rise on the modern world stage. His Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 to his death in 76, its persecutions and struggle sessions bear eerie resemblance to the woke cancel culture of contemporary America, as is witnessed by the testimony of a number of people who actually emigrated from China and experienced it. Only the former was much more draconian and bloody, occurring in a fully totalitarian state. All told, Mao may be responsible for the deaths of close to 80 million people. Mao died in 1976, as I said. Privatization in China started long before it did in Russia. It started with Deng Xiaoping in 1978. He came to power then, and his mission was to repudiate Mao's focus on culture and ideology and rather concentrate on productivity. Deng Xiaoping was a very practical-minded person. The system into which he transmorphed the Chinese economy is sometimes called a socialist market economy. Party control regulates widespread privatization. About 40% currently is private, below the world average of around 60% in many mixed market economies. Although the number of private companies well exceeds the public ones. And so the party control regulates this in a sort of hybrid economy. Deng remarked something to the effect that when ideology and actual productive development and results conflicted, productive development must win, or one is not a materialist. That was an interesting turning on the head of If it doesn't work, then you're not a materialist and you can't be a communist. Um, Very practical. Chinese are very practical in my experience. This is in effect saying that one cannot ignore the productive advantage of the private sector, something which Marx himself acknowledged. In any case, Deng's reforms were carried on by Jiang Zemin and now by Xi Jinping, whose status in China surpasses any modern leader other than Mao. The Belt and Road Initiative is an ambitious plan to develop two new trade routes connecting China with the rest of the world, but it's about more than infrastructure. It's an effort to develop expanded and an interdependent market for China, grow China's economic and political power, and create the right conditions for the development of a high technology economy. There are three main motivations given or that you hear for the beginning of the BRI. One reason, the most discussed internationally, is China's relationship with the U.S. Vast majority of Chinese international trade passes by sea through the Singapore-Malacca Strait off the coast of Singapore, which is a security partner of the U.S. The initiative is integral to China's efforts to create its own more secure trade routes. There is no doubt that China's intention is also to make participating nations interdependent with the Chinese economy, and thereby build economic and political influence for China. In that respect, it has similarities with the Marshall Plan that the U.S. issued following the Second World War, but with the essential difference that China dispenses funding to other nations based purely on shared economic interests, and it's not offering these projects to a conquered power either. Another key reason for the initiative is the legacy of the 2008 financial crisis. China overreacted in a way to the financial crisis with a $4 trillion stimulus package, issuing contracts to build railways, bridges, and airports. This saturated the Chinese economy. Belt and Road Framework provides an alternative market for China's vast state-owned companies beyond the borders of China. They had overshot the mark and had a large surplus of infrastructure investment capital, and BRI was the result. Also, the Belt and Road is seen as a crucial element in the Chinese government's efforts to stimulate economies of the country's central provinces, which historically lagged behind richer coastal areas. The government uses the Belt and Road to encourage and support businesses in these central regions, allocating budget generously and encouraging businesses to compete for Belt and Road contracts. Now, you may wonder what the Belt and the Road is. The Silk Road Economic Belt element refers to plans for a revitalized series of ancient overland trading routes connecting Europe and Asia to be built largely with Chinese expertise. The idea was first proposed by Xi Jinping during a visit to Kazakhstan in 2013, and Central Asia is seen as the most vital region for the belt element. The road might be better termed the route because it refers to sea routes. 2014, after that, Xi Jinping outlined plans to additionally establish new sea trade infrastructure along the old Marco Polo route, a maritime Silk Road connecting China, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. This would be a longer route, avoiding the Malacca Strait, incorporating fueling stations, ports, bridges, industry, and infrastructure through Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean. Pakistan is also seen as key, crucial partner in this effort through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor Project. Now, of course, this has stirred some blowback from the West, which sees China as a peer-level economic power. And so you have some Western scholars and politicians talking about a debt trap. This mostly comes from something that happened in Sri Lanka, which is mischaracterized often in the West. Um, in Sri Lanka, the government there became overburdened with debt and restructured its loan with China. The loan was for a major port and airport project there. However, the loan never went into default, nor did the Chinese seize any assets in the country. The countries agreed to a mutually beneficial workaround where China would lease the port facilities for 99 years and thus offset the debt burden. Some in the West seek to characterize this as a debt trap strategy, notwithstanding the fact that irresponsible behavior on the part of Sri Lanka caused the incident and the fact that this is a rare event and does not characterize China's relations with its BRI partners. Other such claims of debt trap tactics also collapse under scrutiny. In Sri Lanka, as well as other BRI countries, China continues to bend over backward to financially enable its projects. Economic exploitation is not the focus as it has been in Western imperialism, but rather political and economic interdependency through generous financing of economic development projects is sought as a means to ensure stability and mutual growth. Now, I'm not touting the PRC or Xi Jinping as saints, angels, or otherwise altruistic actors. This is all in the best interest of China, but China tends to want to operate on a win-win basis, at least with its partners in the BRI. I don't see this as a form of neo-imperialism. The Chinese also launched a Made in China 2025 state-led industrial policy. It seeks to make China dominant in global high-tech manufacturing. The program aims to use government subsidies, mobilize state-owned enterprises, and pursue intellectual property acquisition to compete with Western technological prowess in advanced industries. About Xi Jinping. What Xi has inherited and effectively promoted and strengthened is a sort of economic nationalism through a mixed market economy, about 40-60, as I said before, private public, directed by a strong central authority. Its current policies are not closely tied to doctrinal or classical Marxist-Leninist Maoist thought, except in terms of nomenclature and concentration of power in the party apparatus. Economic control under authoritarian single-party leadership would be considered fascist without a moral or religious base, much like the current American government under its uniparty establishment. However, China has made considerable strides in resurrecting its traditional Confucian orientation, though this is a work in progress. Hu Jintao, Xi's predecessor, was somewhat of a proponent of the Confucian concept of the harmonious society, both internally and at the international level. Xi is also quite fond of quoting Confucius and styling himself as a patriarch of China, implicating Confucian filial piety. This is in stark contrast to Mao, who reviled China's Confucian heritage. But we'll get back to that. I want to talk politics in some depth because there's a lot of confusion about what they mean by communist and why they can have such a large private sector. There's a basis for socialism with Chinese characteristics in Marxist-Leninist thought, but it is unconventional by the normal standards of doctrinaire communists. What Deng, Jiang, Hu, and Xi have said is that the Marxist development model, when it is applied to a primitive economy, not in the final stages of hypercapitalism, must utilize state-controlled private sector market elements in order to facilitate the same economic development that would occur under a longer period of market capitalism. The Marxist revolution was only supposed to naturally occur in highly developed capitalist economies. However, due to revolutionary politics in the 20th century, control by the Communist Party jumped the gun, so to speak, and short-circuited the full life cycle of capitalist economic development which would only be expected to result in a socialist revolution in these primitive economies like that of China. It's actually fascinating that they characterize themselves for purposes of this as a primitive economy. Um, it would only be expected to result in socialist revolution after perhaps 100 years of normal capitalist development. So the task of the Communist Party of China is not to return power to the capitalists, God forbid, but to manage a mixed market hybrid economy with the aim of full economic development without rigid ideological conformity to any simplistic reductionism of Marxist thought. This actually makes some sense theoretically. I am not sympathetic to Marxism or communism in the slightest, but this is probably the best way to rationalize implementing a classic mixed market welfare state under authoritarian control that one could expect from a system where allegiance to the Communist Party in some form is mandatory due to the nationwide hold it has on Chinese society. However, the degree to which the Chinese populace is disagreeable to party control is debatable, given Chinese meteoric rise over recent decades. Xi has also enacted or promoted a more aggressive foreign policy with regard to China's relations to the U.S. There's something called the Nine-Dash Line in the South China Sea. We'll get back to that in a minute. This is the line of territory that China claims in the South China Sea, which overlaps some of the territory that other countries claim in that area. The Sino-Indian border dispute, the political status of Taiwan, and some other matters. He has sought to expand China's African and Eurasian influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. He's expanded support for state-owned enterprises, advanced military-civil fusion, overseen targeted poverty alleviation programs, and has attempted to reform the property sector. He has also promoted common prosperity, a series of policies designed with stated goals to increase equality, and used the term to initiate an array of regulations on the tech and tutoring sectors in 2021. She met with Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou in 2015, the first time the PRC and the Republic of China leaders met. Though relations deteriorated after Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, won the presidential elections in 2016. He overreacted, in my humble opinion, to the COVID pandemic in mainland China, as did everyone, with a zero COVID approach from January 2020 until December of 2022, afterward shifting to a mitigation strategy. She also oversaw the passage of a national security law in Hong Kong, clamping down on political opposition in the city, especially pro-democracy activists. This should not surprise or alarm us given U.S. sponsorship of NGOs in various countries attempting to foment unrest and sometimes regime change as a political tactic. A note on Confucianism. I didn't realize until recently the extent to which Confucianism has been revived in China. It's comparable in some ways to the revival of Orthodox Christianity in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It may be useful to mark the end of serious communism in China as the ascension of Deng Xiaoping in 1978. It was at that time that market socialism, or socialist market, took shape, and Deng Xiaoping's Gaige Kaifang, reform and opening, took the stage. Compare that with Glasnost and Perestroika, the reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev issued in Russia. Reform and opening in the Chinese case, Glasnost opening, and Perestroika restructuring, reform. This is when things got tricky because introducing mixed market economics delegitimized the government's moral emphasis on Marxist-Leninist Maoist political philosophy as an ethical social restraint, and crime rates soared. Perhaps spontaneously, Confucian temples began to be restored in the 1980s with the acceptance or encouragement of the government. The adoption of market economics was necessary for production, but incipient westernization of culture that appealed to the youth, students, and academics was unwelcome among the general populace and especially the government. This was the era of Tiananmen Square. Um, the solution chosen by the party and to a certain extent by the people back then was a back to basics emphasis on traditional Chinese cultural education, which had been rejected in the era of Mao. A lot of this was blowback from Mao's Cultural Revolution combined with blowback from the opening under Deng Xiaoping, which resulted in Western culture infiltrating to a certain extent and the takeoff of crime rates. This back to basics caught on like wildfire. China sought to regain its soul after an era of communist darkness. What is remarkable is how quickly the government got behind this effort. But given the social unrest unleashed by flirtation with Western liberalism, perhaps it is not that remarkable that the uncommunist government chose an uncommunist solution, the illiberal revival of Confucianism. Not Western liberalized Confucianesque pablum, mind you. Real, sexist, patriarchal, authoritarian, filially pious Confucianism of the old school variety. In the mid-1990s, Confucian ceremonies of worship and veneration began to be national televised events, especially Confucius' birthday. Confucian temples were revitalized everywhere, and though Westerners appreciated them mostly as historic relics, the local Chinese, with the support of the government, were worshiping there. This was a mass revival. A government-sponsored religious revival in an ostensibly communist nation. At present, two major official organizations have taken responsibility for the development of Confucianism and the protection of Confucius temples in mainland China. In 1984, the China Confucius Foundation was established. The foundation is registered as a nonprofit organization under the supervision of the Cultural Affairs Ministry. The goal of this foundation is to promote and spread Confucian thought and values at home and abroad by raising money from private sources as well as state funds. The Confucius Temple Protection Association of China was formed in 1994 and registered with the Ministry of Affairs of China. It is a national voluntary association that embraces scholarship on Confucianism as well as Confucius temples and Confucius academies, and aims to preserve Confucius monumentary buildings, promote research on Confucianism, and build connections with Confucius temples and Confucian associations worldwide. This was largely missed or ignored in the Western press and later explained away as political exploitation of ancient culture to effect social control. That, of course, is one way of looking at it, especially if you see Western liberalism as the final form of human development. However, if social disorder does not appeal to you, nor does abandonment of national culture, the development was welcomed as legitimate. And you may recall that the same rationalization was applied and is applied to the revival of Russian Orthodoxy in Russia. Since it is illiberal, by definition, it is artificial and nefarious to Western liberals. And from their perspective, I suppose it is. But that does not mean that the phenomenon is not authentic, sincere, and heartfelt by the Chinese and Russian people. It just means that liberals don't like it. One must ask oneself, what was the indigenous religion of China before the 1949 Communist Revolution? This was Confucianism. It was a hybrid mix, to be sure. Confucianism was the basis, mixed with elements of Taoism and Buddhism. That was the Chinese faith. But Confucianism was the operating system, which allowed for this hybrid to manifest itself. So its revival in China is a return to China's ancestral faith, much like Orthodoxy in Russia. That it is being sponsored and encouraged by the government there, an ostensibly communist government, should cause one to doubt the sincerity of the government's communism rather than the sincerity of its Confucianism. Apparently, the Chinese characteristics which accompany Chinese communism are mixed market economics and the revival of its traditional faith. This is not communism that we know in the West at all. That died with Mao, evidently. This is a communal mixed market economy which is labeled for historical reasons as communist in modern China. The Confucianism that is being practiced is theistic. Tian, heaven, is being worshipped once more by the Chinese just as it formerly was. There is a debate as to whether heaven is personal or not. One can make a case either way, much like one can make a case either way for the Tao of Taoism. But there is certainly evidence from Confucian tradition that points to a personal conception of heaven as a father figure, perfectly in keeping with Confucius's teaching regarding filial piety. In fact, everything that could be said about the compatibility of Taoism and Christ could be said of Confucianism and Christ, and it is a short step from either faith to the realization that the way, or heaven, became flesh and dwelt among us. There was a book by, I don't know, was it Archimandrite or Archpriest? Hieromonk Damascene, who was a student of Father Seraphim Rose. Father Damascene wrote a book called Christ, the Eternal Tao. And the gist of the book was that the Chinese are prepared for the intersection of their idea of the Tao, or heaven, Tian, with the concept of the Logos in Christianity. In fact, in Chinese, you translate, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The translation, legitimate translation by people who know Chinese and know English, is in the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. Because that's the closest concept in their linguistic universe to what Christians mean by the Greek word logos. In Damascene's book, he addresses some distinctions between Lao Tzu and Confucius, saying one was the first to teach loving one's enemies in China, and the other first to suggest the Golden Rule. These are both correct, but we should rather focus on the following fact. Confucianism reflects China's canon law, or external law of community with reference to the eternal. Taoism reflects Chinese mysticism, and Lao Tzu's focus was on the individual, not primarily on the relations within the state. That is the real distinction between them. Confucianism is the external way, Taoism is the internal mystical way, and Taoism is ripe for Christ to come right in there. Now, I'm not, well, I am suggesting evangelism, but I'm not saying that Chinese-Russian relations are solely based on that, or primarily based on targeting the Chinese for proselytism or evangelism. However, it's not a bad idea. Now, the pact with Russia. We discussed in a previous program that China and Russia became ever closer diplomatically during the course of the teens and concluded a partnership without limits shortly before the Russian SMO in February of 2022. This is both an economic and military alliance, though it is not advertised as such openly. However, each understands that they need each other to defeat Western imperialism. hang together or hang separately. Both are highly motivated. And that means that the military cooperation in terms of exercises and strategy we have seen to date is no joke. They will defend each other if need be, and it is in accord with their respective national interests. Of course, each has a formidable military, so that will be unlikely to transpire. However, their economic and diplomatic cooperation is on full display for all to see. China has tacitly supported the Russian SMO while maintaining its ties with Ukraine and the West insofar as that is possible. Russia's activities in the Middle East can be seen as supportive of Chinese ambitions with its BRI initiative. Russia saved the Syrian regime from Western regime change. It is allied with Iran, which secures the northern corridor of West Asia. That was the Iran, Syria, Lebanon crescent that we spoke about. The Belt and Road passes right through all that. The future. War with China would be financially devastating for both the West and China. However, as time passes, the potential cost to the West increases. The Western tariffs initiated in 2018 made a significant but relatively modest dent in U.S. China trade, but resulted in an equally significant rise in China EU trade. China's A2AD layered defenses in the South China Sea, encompassing Taiwan and beyond, would be difficult for the U.S. to decisively penetrate with a surface presence. China needs a relatively short time to conquer the island if left to its own defenses, perhaps less than a week. The U.S. would have to respond immediately to any blockade or invasion in order to avoid having to undo a fait accompli. I am skeptical of the U.S.'s political resolve to undertake such a mission, even in the best of circumstances, which we cannot say are in effect presently. The U.S. already has 2 wars to deal with. Defense of Taiwan is likely a bluff due to the impact it would have on world advanced semiconductor production, of which Taiwan is responsible for about 92%. In short, perhaps the military industrial complex might derive some ephemeral benefit, but business would suffer if the U.S. entered the conflict. And American weapons have not fared well against Russia in the Ukraine conflict. That may also be the case with Taiwan. And it would be pointless. How is the United States going to keep down a country of 1.4 billion people with China's manufacturing capacity indefinitely short of a nuclear war? And China has nuclear weapons. It's actually madness if you think about it, and that's why I believe it will not happen. I could be wrong. Who knows? However, there's a wider dispute in the region which has not yet erupted militarily, but which could potentially do so. And that is China's general claim to much of the South China Sea and the Nine Dashes controversy. The Nine Dashes, as I said before, refers to an area delineated on many Chinese maps which appear to assert sovereignty over large areas of the South China Sea. This involves claims by China, Taiwan, the Philippines, and other states in the region to water rights and rights over islands in the area. Unlike the Taiwan dispute itself, the broader South China Sea rivalry appears almost made to turn into a proxy fight between China and one or more of America's allies in the South China Sea. The significance of the island ring is that it is seen both by China and the U.S. as being a form of containment, preventing China from expanding influence eastward into the Western Hemisphere. Many, including Professor John Mearsheimer, consider this a vital strategic interest of the United States, maintaining this containment so China cannot expand into the Americas or America's Pacific sphere of influence. That conflict could erupt at any time. So what are we looking at as a prospective future? As someone born in America, I too have been influenced by the fact that America has fought 3 wars against Asians in the last century: Japan in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. This, plus the rise of Japan in the 1980s, has contributed to an American cultural tendency to villainize Asians in general and China in particular. Mao's Cultural Revolution and Chinese communism did nothing to help this stigma. And finally, the fact that China still, inaccurately, considers itself a communist nation, despite its mixed market economy and revived national religious culture. Just the mere term communist has the power to alienate Americans for long-standing political reasons dating back to the early 20th century. However, times change. The most dramatic change that we are looking at is the decline of the American dollar and the rise of the international renminbi, RMB, the Chinese currency, as a reserve currency for international trade in the East and beyond. This transformation will likely happen much more quickly than the move from the pound sterling to the dollar due to contemporary technology and the rapid interconnectivity of the world today as opposed to during the early 20th century. When you couple this with China's BRI and the geopolitical interest that creates with the alliance with Russia and the unfolding drama in the South China Sea, China plays a central role in the international politics of the future. Xi and Putin have formed a dynamic partnership. Sun Tzu would be impressed. Anti-export clauses in EU contracts against China result in more export to China. Regardless of Western strategies, China benefits from anti-Russian sanctions. Russia benefits from refocusing trade toward the East. This is a win-win for Russia and China. If you find this program valuable, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.